here, so I better start on time. It's 1:15, so we'll get going. My name's Lindsay Morton. I work at Avondale College in Australia, and today it's my great pleasure to introduce you to these three speakers. It looks like a fantastic panel. The session title is Content, Form and Time, Style as Argument. Our first speaker for today is David Dowling here. And David's paper, as you probably will have noticed on your program, has won the Susan Greenberg Prize for Best Research Paper. That's fantastic. David's research interests include cultural production and media industries. He's particularly interested in how institutions shape culture and have an impact on it. The paper that he's presenting today is part of a larger project for the Iowa Writers' Workshop, I believe. And the title is Banned in Britain, Marilynne Robinson's Radical Environmental Journalism. So thank you, David.
So during the height of the nuclear arms race in the 1980s, the British arm of Greenpeace seemed the least likely target of a relentless journalistic investigation so damaging that the organization instantly launched a legal counterattack. Perhaps more stunning was that the work in question, Mother Country, Britain, the Welfare State and Nuclear Pollution, was penned by the mild-mannered Marilynne Robinson, then known for the subtle and rich ruminations on nature and spirituality in her 1980 novel, Housekeeping. These first two books, along with her subsequent writings, have established her as what many consider the world's best prose stylist and most distinguished living author. The best mind of her generation concentrated her powers of investigation and critique on the seemingly unassailable environmental group. Quote, a bookish woman all my life, as she described herself in The Givenness of Things, her Emerson-inspired collection of lectures and essays. Quote, with a long, quiet life behind her, has few opportunities to shock, even scandalize, and that is part of the appeal of her vitriolic assault on the British nuclear program. For an accomplished author known for her more recent novels, Gilead, Home, and Lila, which drew critical acclaim with along with the admiration of Barack Obama, most familiar with Robinson would be surprised that she regards Mother Country as her greatest literary achievement. Gilead won a Pulitzer Prize in 2004 and was followed by her 2008 publication of Home, its prequel that won the coveted Orange Prize for Fiction awarded in the UK, cementing her status as a world-class author, quote, considered as essential as Nabokov and Conrad. That year, the Times of London proclaimed Robinson, quote, the world's best writer of prose. Among her most devoted readers was Barack Obama, who, in an unprecedented move by an American president, assumed the role of journalist and conducted an interview of Robinson that appeared in the New York Review of Books in 2014. Moments after he had placed the National Humanities Medal around her neck in July of the previous year, the president confided, quote, your writings have fundamentally changed me. I think for the better, Marilynne. I believe that. So obscured by such acclaim for Robinson's fiction is Mother Country, her powerful first and only work of literary journalism, which appeared in 1989. Reflecting on nearly 4 decades of her illustrious career, she recently said, quote, if I could have written one book, Mother Country would have been that book, would have to be that book. She consistently has called it her proudest achievement. Critics and followers of Robinson may be enamored with her fiction, but this singular work of nonfiction deserves closer scrutiny in light of her own insistence on its superiority to the novels that established her among the world's most distinguished living writers. So this crowning achievement of her career has been overlooked by all but Robinson herself, mainly because of the critical neglect of literary journalism as a genre, a pattern that John Hartsock has identified. The purpose of this research then is to reclaim Mother Country as one of environmental journalism's most radical works, notable for its unprecedented assault on Greenpeace for its role as a government operative, systematically abetting deadly toxic pollution. Like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Robinson's environmental literary journalism builds on the genre's method of civic engagement, which John J. Pauley defines as cultural interpretation and critique through narrative strategies of, quote, artfulness and moral insight. Carson's signature 1963 indictment of industrial agriculture for its use of the pesticide DDT first appeared serially in the New Yorker and soon after as an international bestseller. It was at the forefront of her generation's, quote, turn toward questions of culture and away from standard categories of news coverage that no longer adequately captured the era's sense of its own experience, end quote, according to Pauly's description of the movement. Decades later in the 1980s, Robinson then joined literary journalists like John McPhee in a new wave of narrative eco-criticism exposing the environmental and human toll of rampant and unfettered industrial waste as a normal course of production. This research is important because it highlights a largely forgotten yet invaluable contribution to this movement in Mother Country, a work that not only elicited a major lawsuit for libel against Robinson, but was subsequently banned in Britain. This magnum opus was one of the world's greatest living writers, stands out as the most trenchant indictment of corruption on behalf of government and industry perpetrated through the media by an environmentalist literary group, in this case, the British division of Greenpeace, in the history of literary journalism. So Robinson saw in British news a tendency to conceal agents of action behind events. Playwright and theorist Bertolt Brecht objected to the same predilection in early 20th century escapist bourgeois literature. Brecht responded by engaging audiences in what John J. Pauly calls the drama of civic life by disrupting the smooth veneer of his play's dominant narratives with placards, usually giant placards, marched onto stage mid-scene. These giant signs in Brechtian theater baldly identify the otherwise subtly concealed perpetrators of economic domination and engineers of injustice behind the unfolding events depicted on stage. Robinson's book functions like a Brechtian placard, defiantly undercutting the prevailing myth of, quote, how England is established in their narrative as a mild and scrupulous old nation, end quote. She calls attention to not only the environmental crimes perpetrated by the government, but also its elaborate strategic communication program to conceal Sellafield's mortal threat to the citizenry. So it was within the political climate of the late 1980s in which she grew increasingly discontent with the television, radio, and print coverage of the petroleum waste routinely pumped into the Irish Sea at the Sellafield nuclear plant on the shore of England's storied Lake District, the charming countryside that originally inspired William Wordsworth. The government leveraged the media as a public relations tool, quote, to let the public know what it must accept in order to produce quiet, while the government launches into its vast program of construction that will make Britain an ever greater center of petroleum extraction and waste dumping, end quote. No Nukes bestsellers like Jonathan Schell's The Fate of the Earth focused on impending nuclear war to the exclusion of the problem of what Robinson calls, quote, cleansing the sea of tons of radioactive sludge and cleansing the air and earth and discovering and limiting the varieties of harm already done, end quote. The problem, according to Robinson, stemmed from the systematic omission, placing it, quote, outside democratic political control. First of all, because books like this one about nuclear issues do not tell the public the problem exists. So in the late 1980s, media attention to environmental concerns in the United States was riveted to 3 Mile Island, the nuclear disaster that occurred in Pennsylvania in March of 1979. The partial meltdown became the most significant accident in the nation's history of commercial nuclear power plants. President Jimmy Carter toured the control room soon after the incident, as all major U.S. news outlets covered the story. The environmental movement in the U.S., which warned against the consequences of lax regulation of toxic materials, seized upon 3 Mile Island to illustrate the perils of nuclear catastrophe, in part because the disaster occurred just 12 days after the major motion picture, The China Syndrome, prophetically told the fictional story of a similar meltdown. 4 years later, the national dialogue on nuclear armament had escalated as the Reagan-Thatcher era of nuclear weapons proliferation and industrial deregulation surged on a patriotic wave of anti-Soviet sentiment. The day after, which is pictured here, aired on ABC television. I can remember watching it. I think I was in high school. In 1983, as a sobering portrait of the terrors that loomed. The Washington Post recently ranked the program the day after among, quote, the most profound moments in television history. The broadcast drew the second largest audience ever according to Nielsen ratings. 3 Mile Island was hardly the story of the nuclear age. Sellafields damaged the environment and linked to soaring rates of fatal disease, especially cancer and leukemia, dwarfed the fallout of the Pennsylvania disaster. 3 Mile Island's release of radiation has been estimated at 15 to 25 curies of radioactive iodine, a fraction of the, quote, many hundreds and thousands of curies that entered the environment each year through Sellafield's pipeline and its stacks that you see here in the picture. Crucially, such waste entered the environment not as a one-time isolated incident, but in the course of Sellafield's routine functioning. Quote, 3 Mile Island, Robinson astutely observed, was a modest event by the standards of Sellafield, and even if disaster had not been averted, would have made no comparable impact on the Earth's habitability, end quote. Yet the story of Sellafield, really the 20th century version of Great Britain's dark satanic mills that horrified Karl Marx, had disappeared in the proper headlines of the British media, as reports dutifully followed the government's public relations campaign to quell an independent investigation. The warnings of the sole whistleblower then vanished when courts banned and pulped Mother Country in the wake of Greenpeace's libel suit against Robinson that muzzled her clarion call to action. The British government followed through on its threat to ban the book when she refused to redact passages it alleged were libelous. So Robinson's staunch defense of the natural environment is visible in the latter-day muckraking of her Harper's expose journalism that fueled Mother Country. So originally published in Harper's, then turns into the book Mother Country with all of this investigative journalism that she did. Her investigative reportage revealed that the British nuclear reprocessing plant of Sellafield had systematically covered up its practice of pumping radioactive waste into the Irish Sea. Still worse, Greenpeace was fully aware of the practice, yet abetted it by distributing, quote, false information about its role in chartering legislation to stop the disposal of toxic waste at sea. So the most stunning revelation of Robinson's narrative is also the most intimately subjective moment in the text. So through a bizarre publicity stunt reflective of the government's effectiveness in conditioning public opinion, or engineering consent, as public relations pioneer Edward Bernays would have it, Greenpeace proved more lapdog than watchdog. So striking a pose of opposition, Greenpeace tested the outer limits of its credibility with the reading public in its reports of what Robinson found the most absurd mission in its history, a plan that disintegrates rapidly when held up to scrutiny. A group of bronzed young divers manned a vessel with the objective of capping the double pipeline that had been spewing plutonium into the Irish Sea. This, quote, rescue mission was actually a pseudo-event akin to the fake live shot that became a staple of broadcast television in the 1980s. In their reports to the media, Greenpeace cast itself as heroically launching into action after a family had written their member of parliament raising concern about the conditions near the plant. According to Greenpeace's improbable tale, the organization gallantly sent divers beneath the sea, quote, to cap the pipeline, but since over 1 million gallons of radioactive material passed through the pipeline in the course of a day, Robinson rightly questioned whether, quote, people working under the water could actually hope to cap a double pipeline through which so much toxic liquid was flowing, end quote. Such exposure to radioactivity would certainly harm the divers on the one hand, and capping the pipeline would precipitate further disaster by flooding the shore and the interior of the plant, on the other hand, making for, quote, a dubious piece of environmentalism, as she calls it. Reports insisted that Greenpeace's mission would have succeeded had the divers not discovered that, quote, and this is the most ridiculous part, had the divers not discovered that the mouth had been changed so that the cap they had prepared for it would not fit. Wow. It's a plumbing issue, I guess. An explanation highlighting the government's surveillance over Greenpeace. Perhaps the least credible aspect of the story was Greenpeace's willingness to expose its own divers to waters they had not measured in advance with a Geiger counter, which later revealed radioactivity at 1,500 times normal levels. So incredulous, Robinson asked, quote, why would fit young men with their lives before them diving near the pipeline because it released radioactivity and who had a Geiger counter along not test the condition of the water before they entered it? So the operation, as it was reported, presumed that, quote, one could dive into the thick, this is Robinson's, one of her most priceless lines, one could dive into the thick of the most prolonged and intense contamination in the world and rise out of it as fresh as Wordsworth's Proteus, an apt literary allusion given the proximity of the poet's Cumbria cottage to the scene. So the fallout from Mother Country ranged from the courtroom in which Greenpeace took no quarter in suing Robinson to the fullest extent of the law, to the pages of the New York Review of Books, where she endured a savage British counter-assault. Dr. Douglas Black, very appropriately named, Dickens couldn't have done better, a British chemical engineer, in a logical sleight of hand, argued that plutonium could only be linked to the area's soaring leukemia death rate if a decrease in waste resulted in a decrease in disease. Right? So since no plans to reduce the waste existed, such measurements were impossible. This meant, quote, according to Robinson, future leukemia excesses will actually exonerate the plant as present ones have done, end quote. Information about Sellafield was limited and of poor quality, despite Greenpeace's claim to have placed a mole in the plant. The laxity of laws and lack of public information through the press was due to the British government's interest in maintaining and expanding its nuclear program under Thatcher and protecting, of course, its tourist revenue from the popular beaches of Cumbria. So Robinson's key finding highlights how, quote, people believe selectively and are outraged selectively, usually about isolated spills, leaks, and fires, which tend to, quote, normalize Sellafield so that grave men can compare its safety record with those of other plants and industries. American Greenpeace, she said, was no help to me in writing the book, she said in a recent interview, noting that their current pamphlets disingenuously credit themselves for, quote, scoring a ban on sea dumping of nuclear waste, although they knew well that, according to her, quote, British Greenpeace sued me for damaging their reputation. I love this line. Though I grieve at my failure to have done so. She's my hero. So even among the most radical environmental journalism, Robinson bears the distinction of operating as watchdog of watchdogs. So the reception of her magnum opus was profoundly influenced by its censorship that removed it from the market of readers to which the book spoke the most directly. Robinson's activist literary journalism deserves recognition for its radical place in the environmental movement. Her revelation in Mother Country of industrialization's threat to the ecosystem and human health builds on the foundation then of Thoreau's Walden. Mother Country is an apt companion piece to John McPhee's The Control of Nature, which also appeared in 1989, and I would suggest that future scholarship would benefit from a comparative study of these works, both the same year they appeared. Focused on the desecration of America's mightiest and most storied river, McPhee sounds a similar note in his litany of oil and chemical companies invading the shores of the Mississippi. In an outraged tone resonant with Robinson's, he envisions the Sixth World War would do less damage to southern Louisiana, and nature, in its place, had become the enemy of the state. Since then, oppositional voices have emerged, such as that of Bill McKibben, pictured here in a somewhat compromising position, editor of American Earth Environmental Writing since Thoreau, and Phyllis Austin, feminist alternative voice in the eco-journalism press, co-editor of On Wilderness Voices from Maine. Robinson shares Carson's belief that, quote, the public had a fundamental right to know and should be mobilized to act to improve the system, especially in the spirit of Sinclair Lewis and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Thank you.
I need to introduce Josh. I think everybody here either knows Josh or has been contacted by him. He's the outgoing research chair for IALJS, so thanks so much, Josh, for your work on this conference. Today is a bit of a departure. Is that fair enough? Is the topic of this paper?
Sure.
We're going to hear from Josh. The title of his paper is Hidden in Plain Style, The Anti-Bomb Politics of John Hersey's Hiroshima.
So I'm going to start with a quote, epigraph from Hersey's 1984 essay, The Legend on the License, his sort of pushback against the new journalism of the 60s and early 70s. Hersey wrote, "We read journalism, or most of us still do anyway, to try to learn about the external world in which our psyches have to struggle along. And the quality we most need in our informant is some measure of trustworthiness." I'll be kind of talking about how Hersey himself tries to create that trustworthiness through a certain stylistic approach in Hiroshima. So 25 years after the New Yorker devoted its entire August 31, 1946 issue to the publication of John Hersey's Hiroshima, the author responded to a letter from the historian Michael Avondale. Their 1971 correspondence picked up a thread the two men had begun several years earlier. In the letter, Hersey spoke about his iconic story, telling the historian, quote, "Generations of school children have read it, and the letters I still get in considerable numbers suggest the book has had a moral impact. I believe, and I still believe, that the tension that came from the deliberate suppression of horror gave an effect far more morally disturbing than would have been achieved had I shouted or screamed my outrage." Hersey's disclosure here is significant. He not only acknowledges a political point of view about the bomb, but he also confesses his intentional attempt to censor that viewpoint in his writing. Critics and scholars from Hersey's time to ours have argued that Hiroshima's impact is tied directly to its detached apolitical content. And I want to argue against that assumption. Yes, Hersey shed revelatory light on the awesome power and horrific physical consequences of the detonation of the world's first atomic weapon through the eyes of his 6 survivors. Yes, he gave an American public starved for details of the bomb a first-hand account that neither shouted nor screamed outrage. But that doesn't mean it's not there. It is, but it's masked by a plain style of writing that had as much to do with the piece's acceptance as did the content. Hiroshima's popularity was immediate and its reach vast, aided by a press release announcing its publication and advanced reviews. When the New Yorker hit newsstands on August 29, 1946, the magazine sold its entire 300,000 non-subscription run in an hour. ABC Radio staged a somber 4-night reading of the text for a national audience. Alfred A. Knopf almost instantaneously published the article in book form. The Book of the Month Club selected Hersey's story and sent a free copy to its more than 500,000 subscribers. As Kathy Roberts Ford has noted, quote, "No other publication in the American 20th century was so widely circulated, republished, discussed, and venerated." The question then is why? Hiroshima was released less than 5 years after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which killed 2,386 Americans. Upon entering World War II, the United States forcibly relocated and incarcerated more than 110 Japanese Americans living along the Pacific coast. The last internment camp at Tule, California did not close until March 21st, 1946. A virulent anti-Japanese sentiment still coursed through American culture after the war ended. So then, how did a story rooted in empathy for the Japanese cause publishers to, quote, "largely disregard commercial imperatives to provide as many Americans as possible with vital information and a forum for debate about the unsettling moral, political, and social realities of atomic warfare and the new atomic age?" That's Kathy Ford. The answer, I argue, is Hersey's plain style made such a distasteful moral act palatable for large numbers of American readers. When Time magazine, Hersey's former employer, commented on Hiroshima's phenomenal reception a week after it was published, it called the story, quote, "a brilliant piece of journalism," and noted Hersey's, quote, "restrained first-rate reporting." 3 months later, writing for the New York Times book review, Charles Poore added his voice to the echo of praise and noted that its subtlety stirred thousands. Scholars have followed in their appraisal. In 1974, Avondale noted the, quote, "objective simplicity of its prose." Decades later, Norm Sims praised Hersey for, quote, "wisely avoiding politics." And most recently, Kathy Ford noted that Hiroshima is, quote, "told not through the detached, self-justifying perspective of Americans, but through the intimate experiences of 6 civilian victims in a Japanese city, and that Hersey, quote, neither moralized nor offered overt judgments. It simply described in relentless detail the experiences of 6 survivors. The thread that connects nearly 70 years of these responses is the assumption that subtlety is simple, that plain style is apolitical, and that the facts of the story speak for themselves. A close look at Hersey's rhetorical choices illustrate how these assumptions are false. Hersey establishes his authority through an unrelenting presentation of precise times and measurements. He employs an unadorned style of writing that garners readers' trust by abandoning rhetorical flourishes. He pulls readers along through a looping, nonlinear narrative with constant temporal transitions that seemingly link the stories together. Hersey further enhances the narrative by hiding his reporting via conventional attribution. A result of taking the marks off of his reporting is a presentation of characters that appear representative of Hiroshima's victims, when in fact they display religious and occupational characteristics familiar to most Western audiences. Hersey uses a limited, omniscient point of view for much of the story, which removes direct agency from the events and replaces it with a more dramatic emphasis on fate. He plays down the political and militaristic context, rendering the events in a cultural vacuum. And finally, there are several key moments in Hiroshima where Hersey betrays his plain style by deploying figurative language that directly editorializes his disdain for the bomb. And basically what I do throughout the rest of the paper is I kind of take up each of those claims and offer some textual evidence. And so a lot of this, the textual stuff is kind of cut for this version. So the compositional history of Hiroshima, I would say, read Ben Yagoda's 11 pages in his history of the New Yorker about town, and you get a good inside look there. When the magazine appeared in the last week of August, the editorial strategy that Ross and Sean developed with Hersey was evident immediately as the first sentence struck with what one critic described as, quote, almost biblical power. That energy comes from Hersey's exactitude, and we all know this first sentence. At exactly 15 minutes past 8 in the morning on August 6, 1945, Japanese time, at the moment when the atomic bomb flashed above Hiroshima, Ms. Toshiko Sasaki, a clerk in the personnel department of the East Asia Tin Works, had just sat down at her place in the plant office and was turning her head to speak to the girl in the next desk. Hersey maintains this level of specificity throughout the text as he recreates the stunning moment of impact in the torturous days after the explosion from the point of view of 6 survivors. For example, he includes the exact distance of each character from the epicenter of the explosion. Reverend Tanimoto was 3,500 yards, or 2 miles from the center. Ms. Sasaki had, quote, taken a single step. The house was 1,350 yards, or 3/4 of a mile from the center. And if you read the piece, you know how he goes through each character and gives us the exact distance that each was from the epicenter. These distances play an integral role in the story. They establish, validate, and cement Hersey's authority. Journalistic authority derives from specificity. It is how the reporter signals expertise to the reader. Years later, Hersey would write that, quote, in fiction, the writer's voice matters. In reporting, the writer's authority matters. He was not an eyewitness to the events in Hiroshima, but he makes up for that lack of a first-hand account by assaulting the reader with precise details. Later in the narrative, Hersey is meticulous with measurements of the bomb's magnitude, and you can go through and see all the people that came in and did all the measurements of the radioactivity afterwards, and he gives us, once again, a lot of very precise examples and from sort of the power of the bomb. These details may seem superfluous, but they serve an essential function. They gain the reader's trust. In the absence of bearing direct witness, Hersey gains reader confidence by appealing, quote, in seeming disinterest to people whose pride is their no-nonsense connoisseurship of fact. In his essay, The Politics of Plain Style, the literary critic Hugh Kenner, who I was just quoting there, argues that if a writer presents a story plainly with measurable data, then readers often do not question the text because there are no embellishments to examine. The plain style is a compositional approach that eschews figurative language and complex sentence structure, accurate descriptors of Hersey's approach in Hiroshima. Although the style is unadorned, direct, and simple, Kenner has called it, quote, the most disorienting form of discourse yet invented by man. That confusion results from the tacit, erroneous assumption that, quote, a man who does not make his language ornate cannot be deceiving us. This is not to say Hersey intended to smuggle in a hidden message. Intent actually has nothing to do with it. Rather, it's an acknowledgement that writing, which is restrained, subtle, and simple, one could say objective, is just as political as writing that is an overt polemic. The politics are just encoded in a different way. All writing is stylized, and all styles are politicized. In Hiroshima, Hersey's voice is the epitome of detachment. The payoff for this precise, sterile tone is that it allows readers into the story. Even though Hersey employs a surfeit of minutiae, as I was just describing, the narrative does not get bogged down. Like much literary journalism, he does not offer traditional sourcing in his main text, and the result of this hidden reporting is a smoother narrative that is not slowed down by the hiccups of attribution. Readers may not notice this. Instead, they experience the feeling of being pulled along by the story. Hersey heightens this narrative flow by constantly linking the characters' stories together via discrete temporal cues. Hiroshima is riddled with adverbs like just and conjunctions like after and as. If you go back and look, you'll see how many times he starts sentences with just as or then. And what it does is the result is a heightened sense of drama and suspense, and Hersey situates the reader in a continually unfolding present where they witness what the characters were doing, where they witness what the characters are doing before, during, and after the bomb blasts. I have all these examples of time. These temporal devices create a sense of synchronicity. They construct the illusion that the characters and events are connected. They also add to the narrative's authority by demonstrating that the reporter pieced the events together with such precision that he could link them with sequential specificity. I go on to talk about sort of Hersey, the 6 characters that Hersey uses. And then I say, a more pernicious effect of Hersey's character selection is the way it presents the individuals as representative of the Hiroshima population, when in fact they're not. Before the air raid evacuations, 380,000 people lived in the city. At the time of the bombing, though, only 245,000 remained. Hersey notes that among that population, only 150 people were medical doctors, and more than 35% of them were killed during the bombing, with nearly the rest of the doctors gravely wounded. And yet, Dr. Fuji and Dr. Sasaki comprised 1/3 of the characters in the text. Likewise, fewer than 1% of Hiroshima's 1945 population identified denominationally as denominationally Christian. Nonetheless, half of the characters in Hersey's story are adherents to Christian theology. These professional and religious characteristics not only help make the characters more recognizable to Western readers, but they humanize the individuals as well. Coincident with the text's Christianization is Hersey's reductive rendering of Japanese culture. He goes out of his way to represent them as permissive, polite, and nationalistic. They are easily dealt with by a Western reader. Not only are they not presented as a threat, but they also appear unreasonably understanding of their plight. Again, a list of examples of the sort of the reductive characterizations, and I can send my paper to people if you're interested. Hersey's selection of these moments both ennobles the Japanese and essentializes their ethnic and national characteristics and strips them of individual identity. They become objects of pity rather than subjects acting within their own minds. A subtler byproduct of Hersey's hidden reporting is the decision to adopt a limited, omniscient point of view, which Harold Ross insisted upon during the editing process. Aided by an absence of attribution, this point of view eliminates explicit agency from the events. Instead, Hersey emphasizes luck and fate as the primary determiners of occurrences and outcomes. For example, after the blast, Dr. Sasaki, quote, calculated that if he had taken his customary train that morning, he would have perished. However, quote, thanks to where he stood, he was untouched. And there's examples all through with each of the characters expressing gratitude that the fates intervened and saved them. I say, while chance and happenstance may well account for why some people lived and others died, highlighting fate while downplaying structural and individual explanations further serves to insulate readers. Not only is fate a more dramatic plot device, but it is also less confrontational. If life and death is left to providence, readers bear no implication and concomitantly no guilt. The opaque line between life and death in Hiroshima is a direct result of Hersey's lack of transparency. He never divulges his reporting methods, his character or scene selection, his thought processes, or his emotional reaction to witnessing the effects of a weapon so powerful that it could destroy civilization. By erasing these marks from his reporting and writing process, Hersey denies readers the opportunity to judge his decisions. When that opacity is mixed with what Hugh Kenner calls, quote, the artifice of the candid, no-nonsense observer, the result is negation of reader agency. All that is left is to respond to the content of the story, which in this case is so unequivocally awful that it narrows the emotional choices to one, decontextualized horror. The text's flat affect not only presents a seemingly sterile political context, but it also makes the gory details stand out even more. These details are not sensationalized. They do not need to be. But they do stand out even more because of the understated nature of the rest of the text. In this case, the plain style heightens the drama, but narrows the emotional response. For example, after readers are lulled by the precise measurements and distances, Hersey introduces the wounded, quote, "The eyebrows of some were burned off and the skin hung from their faces and hands." And we can all recall, skin hanging off in huge glove-like pieces, eyes that have melted out and run down cheeks. So I list all these details, and I say because the text is stripped of both reflexivity as well as political and social context, these scenes become reified, sickening monuments of ruin only to be gazed upon, signifiers lacking a signifier. Then I talk about sort of that there's not much in the way of militaristic context. We don't learn anything really about the war or even the dropping of the second bomb on Nagasaki. It's the next part of the paper. Then I say the counter-arguments to my criticisms are clear. The story, as the title suggests, is about the destruction of Hiroshima, and not John Hersey's reaction to the destruction of Hiroshima. Moreover, as every first-year literature student knows, it's unfair to critique a text for not doing what you want it to do. What both of these points fail to consider, however, is that it is not only fair, but essential to examine the choices Hersey made in both the selection of some events and details and the omission of others. Although Hiroshima, in the best tradition of literary journalism, is factual and accurate to the events that happened on August 6, 1945, it is nonetheless a construction like every other piece of writing. And therefore, what the author leaves out is just as telling as what is included, because, quote, "all decisions are political ones, and in denying them or suppressing the reasons for them, they become ideological." And that's Phyllis Fruss in her book, The Politics and Poetics of Journalistic Narrative. Once again, my point here is not to call Hersey disingenuous. All journalists make choices of selection, framing, and emphasis, and often these choices are informed by, quote, "little tacit theories about what exists, what happens, and what matters." That's Todd Gitlin from The Whole World is Watching. What is clear from a close analysis of Hersey's text is that he and his New Yorker editors shared an understated abhorrence to the bomb's usage. You'll note there's how the editors preface the piece when it appears in the magazine with the "to our readers" comment that talked with it. So a little editorial aside, noting to the readers how important this text is, which that editorial aside doesn't make it into the book version. Quickly, interest. So interest first. So my argument there is that they're alluding to, or they're tipping the hand, or they're saying they're framing the piece in a certain way by saying this. I think interspersed among his precise measurements and plain style are moments when Hersey uses figurative language. These moments are instructive because they denote when Hersey is most overtly shaping language to make a point. With the plain style, he can feign a dispassionate viewpoint, which, as Hugh Kenner notes, is still a viewpoint. But with figurative language, Hersey betrays that dispassion and makes evident his clear antipathy towards the bomb. The first and most revealing example comes at the conclusion of chapter 1. He closes Miss Sasaki's story by saying, quote, "There in the tin factory, in the first moments of the atomic age, a human being was crushed by books." The metaphor here is obvious. Books, a source of knowledge, understanding, and enlightenment, have now also allowed man to conceive and employ a weapon that could quite literally lead to the extinction of humankind. And in an ironic turnabout, it is the books themselves that mete out the pain after the bomb blast. Lots of figurative language examples. I go into some of the more historical responses. There was a really interesting study done in the Journal of Psychology in 1948 that kind of measured the impact, Hersey's impact based on the letters, some 300 some letters that Hersey received. Look at the response in the journal Politics that Dwight MacDonald edited, where he called Hiroshima denatured naturalism, and then Mary McCarthy writes a letter to the editor and just skewers Hersey, calls the text familiar and safe, and in the final sense, boring. And then I think another place where you can sort of see the politics be a little bit more manifest is in the 40 years later when Hersey does the aftermath, and he has all of those during Tanimoto's story. As Tanimoto's trying to advocate for sort of ending nuclear proliferation, Hersey gives us those reminders over and over and over again that of all of the sort of nuclear tests, and so we're learning that Tanimoto's memory like the world's is getting spotty. That's the last line from the aftermath. So I talked real briefly about the legend on the license and how there's a weird kind of amnesia that Hersey has about some of his criticisms of the New Journalists in 1984 and how it kind of plays with some of the things that he does 40 years earlier in Hiroshima. And conclude by saying these confusions and contradictions that he points out point to the slipperiness of style. In the legend on the license, much like in Hiroshima, Hersey operates under the assumption that there is a singular way to apprehend reality, namely collect all the facts, then get out of the way so the story can tell itself. But facts never speak for themselves. All stories are products of imagination and construction. All stories employ a style and a point of view. Hersey falsely believes that his plain and omniscient point of view allows him to escape the criticisms he levels at the new journalists. They do not. But more to the point, however, those criticisms need not exist at all. Instead, what is needed is a fuller critical discussion of the politics of style in literary journalism. Hiroshima is widely regarded as one of the most important works of journalism in the 20th century. Its place atop that mantle owes much to the event it chronicled and the content captured by its author. But a strict focus on its content oversimplifies its construction and overdetermines its effects on readers. Scholars can argue whether Hersey's compositional approach offers readers an honest account of the bombing of Hiroshima or not. But there is no denying the fact that Hersey's plain style is still a style, and like all styles, it's not value neutral.
From content and form to time. I love the title of your paper, Chris. The Journalist Who Was Always Late. It's fantastic. Chris Wilson is a professor of English and American Studies at Boston College. And for those of you who teach, you might be interested to know that he is currently completing an open access online multimedia platform called Reading American Reportage, which is designed as a student's guide and introduction to reading narrative journalism. So if you see him around, feel free to ask him about that. Thank you very much, Chris.
We could have the lights. I don't have any slides. If anybody wants the lights, that would be okay with me. It's right behind you.
Yeah, I would have.
Thanks.
Perfect.
Hi. This talk is part of a couple things that I've been writing lately. Not so much about the rules of literary narrative journalism, but rule breaking. That's kind of a tradition of that, and or taboo elements. For instance, so I wrote a piece about what does it mean when a journalist adopts a pen name and stays anonymous, or what happens when a journalist uses rumor as the sort of substantive fact base of a piece of narrative journalism, or what happens like a narrative rule breaking, like when a journalist puts the setting of the story at the end of the story rather than conventionally at the beginning. That kind of thing. And in fact, this piece that I'm going to read in a second is about, in some ways connected to that last issue. It's about retrospection, about looking backward, or about hindsight. The two element here is hindsight. What does it mean to look back? If some of you have read Michael Lewis's most recent book, The Undoing Project, this is one of the subjects that he talks about, is the fallibility and the seductiveness of hindsight. So I'm going to use that here a little bit and talk about the implications of time and temporality in journalistic narrative. Now, if you've ever wasted too much of your time mucking around in the world of tabloid journalism in the 1930s and 40s, that's the last I have, I admit, you've probably heard of the famous New York tabloid journalist and photographer who called himself Ouija. Now, his real name was Arthur Felling. Some of you may know that. Anyway, Ouija's photographs are these kind of stark, big flashbulb images of the dirt and grime and folly of mid-century New York. There's kind of bodies lying in the street in front of movie houses and crooks being stuffed into police vans and things like this. They made their way into a lot of different kind of cultural locations. They start out in the tabloids, but they end up in the Museum of Modern Art. There was an exhibition at the Getty not very long ago. If you're a trivia buff, there's even an episode of The X-Files about Ouija, actually the inspiration for my talk today. Now anyway, just to explain the name, Ouija, Fella gave himself this name Ouija to refer to the Ouija board. You know what I mean by that? That is the game where everybody puts their hands on, moves around, predicts the future. And that's because it expressed a desire, no doubt familiar to everybody in this room, as if by magic, that Ouija could be present not merely to photograph the aftermath of a crime, that is the body in the street, but to actually be there when the crime was happening. And he dubbed this fantasy psychic photography. Now, the interest for me, though, is not its uniqueness or idiosyncrasy, but in fact, because I think it expresses a desire at the heart of modern news gathering more generally, which is, of course, to get the story, to be at the story, to be present to it, and therefore to redress a condition that I want to talk about today, the predicament of belatedness. By that I mean, for starters, the practically inevitable condition that reporters actually do arrive, in most instances, after or well after a specific news event has occurred. But in the larger sense, how do writers of journalistic narrative manage this condition of belatedness? And how do we talk about time and temporality when we're talking about literary journalism? And again, how do we talk about, or do we talk about, the selective privilege of hindsight and the predicament that it represents interpretively? And what, for instance, would our attention to belatedness or narrative time do, for instance, to the distinction that we all know between supposedly fast and slow journalism? And my specific example today is going to be an essay written by Calvin Trillin. It was written for the New Yorker in the 1970s, and the title is, well, wait a minute, I'll get to the title.
Tease.
Yes. Now, when it comes to thinking about time or temporality in modern journalism, we've tended to begin with the now. That is the premium, professional premium on the present tense. The importance of deadlines, datelines, direct eyewitnessing, offering coverage we call timely. And if you read in a lot of historical communication scholarship, usually the proclamations about the importance of the now emerge in a kind of long historical account that starts with E.P. Thompson or Benedict Anderson or David Harvey. And it's the idea that there's an intrinsic relationship between news and modernization. That is the arrival and eventual hegemony of regimented and measured time and clock consciousness. In other words, news writing and production are supposed to reflect the larger processes, as Anderson puts it, by which the modern subject moves calendrically through homogeneous empty time. Even Susan Greenberg's rightly influential characterization of narrative or long-form reportage as a slow journalism, as everybody knows, that's a term that refers to matters of production, to the ethical treatment of subjects, to greater verifiability, as well as longer form. Greenberg's ideas quite self-consciously positioned itself originally against the cheap and the fast. So it seems like every time we want to slow the clock of journalism down, we end up speeding it up first. And so Michael Schudson writes famously in Reading the News, getting the news fast and ideally getting it first is, of course, passive interest to journalists. And time, Schudson says, is the scaffolding on which news stories are hung. So what happens, though, when we look at that scaffolding or we look at the reader's experience of time? Well, there are a lot of recent explorations of narrative structure in news that have suggested that one way to think about this, and this is true of daily news reporting, not just long form, is that these reports more commonly really contain clusters of, or layers of time or temporality. That is, that they're not only referring to the now, they're referring to the immediate time before that, maybe the distant past, also the immediate future, also the long-term future. Moreover, news writers almost invariably have to deal with the constraints and possibilities of what literary critics call narrative temporality. Or that is, how is a reader experiences time's movement within a given text? And as we all know, in long-form journalism, Josh was just talking about this, writers typically deploy not only different time frames, sometimes they slow down time, or what is sometimes called, after Bakhtin, a thickening of narrative time, or making time bend or buckle. Some analysts, for example, have turned to the meditations of Paul Ricoeur and his views on the so-called double temporality of narrative. And Simply put, that's the idea that there's a kind of direct dialectical coordination between a movement in time where the protagonist and the reader are marching forward through time, but that's met by a counter movement, typically a pressure that attaches significance and meaning to that by looking backward. Those things are happening at the same time. Now, those challenges for us, I think, acquire even more power and poignancy when we begin to recognize the taboo subject of belatedness. Now, again, belatedness is a word that we use generally to speak to the sense of arriving too late or having missed the opportunity one was looking for. In some of the oldest meanings of the word in English are, in fact, connected to being caught out too late or after dark. But this element can be surprisingly germane to slow journalism. One finds, for instance, belatedness appearing in Mark Kramer's famous Breakable Rules essay. Nonfiction writers, he writes, are fated to arrive late. Murderers, he added, usually do not try to do their work in front of writers. But again, more generally, rethinking the role of belatedness and hindsight begins with our not overplaying the story that I actually begin with today. That is about modernization's invisible hand on the clock of journalism. Rather, as Barbie Zelizer, among others, Carey, argues that in journalism, as in other professions, what we typically call ocular proof, that is looking at something, or direct witnessing, things like that, is actually not given face value over time, nor given final say, and that's because, as Zelizer argues, eyewitnessing has always retained associations of subjectivity and incompletion, which is why in the journalism trade, being on the scene is balanced, again, I'll put this in a temporal vocabulary, by retrospection. That is not only by hindsight, but by marshaling various effects of immediacy to make it seem like hindsight isn't in play, or using attribution, that is the marshaling up of testimonies from people who were there at the scene. Now let's make this a little more practical. This problem of retrospect, of course, commonly takes place on the ground. Such patterns explicit, for example, in the routine that Calvin Trillin used for his various New Yorker series, especially in the 1984 volume that's just been re-released, called Killings. This is a book about accidental deaths, murders, suicides in small towns, largely. Now, when you read the book, obviously, we all recognize that Trillin is reconstructing these stories having arrived late. All these killings have usually happened, they're already in court, and the structural premise of his essays really is to kind of cull together everything that happened, often by local rumor, grand jury testimony, local reporting, to retell the story and catch his New Yorker readers up with it. So the readers are asked to go back over the archive of stories and local opinion and re-experience the story that actually unfolded in forward time for the town. And this is the sequential refinement of the facts through retrospect by looking back. Now, the thing I'd like to emphasize today, though, is that Trillin is also manipulating narrative time for his readers. Specifically, the essay that I want to talk about now tells us the story of the death of a young teenage girl. Her name is Fonnie Cooper. She grew up in a rural hill community outside Knoxville, Tennessee. She rebels from her parents' evangelical middle-class world. She's very young, sensitive, prone to dark meditations, very self-conscious and ironic. But anyway, she spirals away from her family into a tougher crowd, making her parents increasingly desperate. They turn around and try to go to the school and to local neighborhoods and so on to kind of track her movements, and until in the tragic penultimate phase of the essay, Fonnie Cooper dies in a car accident while being chased down over winding mountain roads by a car driven by her own father. Chasing her down. Now, at first glance, you read this essay, it might seem to be organized in a very typical kind of neoclassical way. That is, that it's traces her fall, her movement into this deepening group, the rising crisis into the accident, and then the denouement with the trial afterward. However, my point today, though, is if you actually start to look at narrative time in the essay, it works really quite differently. And now I'm going to stop right now and say our eyes are all glazed over if I try to go into all the details about verb tenses and so on. So I'm just going to mention three things. First thing, is that it's almost impossible when you read this essay to find out when Fawny Cooper actually, if she did, fell into deviance. And that has to do with the manipulations of verb tenses and time frames that Trillin uses throughout the opening gambit of the essay. The second thing is that when we get into the really crisis point of the story, the car chase, time actually thickens for a reader. That is, it slows down. Right when you think the action should be speeding up, after all, it's a car chase, Trillin starts on the day of Fawny's death. He itemizes the movements she makes. He slows down the narrative clock even further into a kind of slow motion time. So Fawny's father, this guy named Leo Cooper, watches Fawny's car turning it over and over in the air. Leo observes, "I thought it was an eternity before I could find her body." For the traumatized father, we might say conventional clock time becomes a forever time, lived over and over again, not moving forward at all. But thirdly, the third effect, one of the more eerie things in this particular essay, is that Trillin deploys several complicated devices to highlight the antithetical narrative and temporal frames that Ricoeur would have seen here. That is, Fawny obviously is pulled forward in time towards her death. But the other thing that Trillin does is Fawny Cooper is eerily given the power of premonition. She is able to see forward into her own fate, as if she has her own Ouija board. She even writes a poem a week before the accident saying she thinks she's going to die without knowing why. Trillin, a poet himself, crystallizes Fawny's premonitions into a poetic refrain, a phrase that gets repeated through the essay. She starts saying everything is too late, or it's just too late, without ever articulating what the it is. Indeed, like Fawny's parents, you might say, Trillin is gathering up evidence in hindsight, but because he's writing in his now, he can't do anything about it. As such, this is where the intentionally nebulous title of his book, Killings, comes into play, because we don't know when we're reading this how it is that Fawny will meet her death, nor when we see it do we know what it was, suicide, murder, or accident. Fawny becomes as removed from us in time as she is to the people who begin to testify about her. Again, as she says, it's too late. But I want to go back one last time to that scene of the crime, that slow motion death that Leo Cooper witnesses. When you go into this thickened narrative time, you'll see, obviously, that the thickening creates the aura of realism, of being there. And this is the question about authentication that John's talking about. Of eyewitnessing. This is what John Hartsock has argued more generally. Creates the feeling of transport. I saw the car airborne, Leo says, up in the air. It was up in the air. And then it completely rolled over one more time. It started to make another flip forward, and just as it started to flip to the other side, it flipped back this way, and my daughter's body came out. Now that's grim stuff, to be sure. Nevertheless, the thing that we should notice is that it is only with the belated arrival of the temporal attribution, Trillin says, he later testified, that we suddenly realize that the scene that we're watching is being narrated in a courtroom, and the source of the scene is, of course, Leo Cooper himself, thinking back in time. But that, of course, is the rub. Fawny Cooper's father is on trial for having caused the accident in the first place. So the source that Trillin attributes or uses to slow his journalism down is the very force from which Fawny was running. The various immediacy, the emotional saturation, and the slow time of Leo's testimony, and even, I would say, the care with which it is rendered, is also what makes it so suspect, because it's his hindsight. In fact, we might think of Trillin a little bit like Fawny herself, as hoping to be Leo Cooper's foil in time, because if the local headlines have plunged Trillin back in time, Fawny Cooper has moved forward into those headlines with her death, but ultimately she disappears into the memory of the people she was trying to escape from. And oh, here is the title of the essay I'm describing. It's just too late. Now, sitting here in this moment in time, Some of you may legitimately protest, after all, the title of a long-form journalist essay is something that we encounter at the start of our reading, not, that is, so belatedly. A title we typically think is the first move. It's an opening gambit. However, what I'm trying to say today is a title is actually something that accompanies us as we are propelled forward in narrative time. But as such, its meanings are sequentially layered and transformed as a consequence of that movement. Only when we arrive at a moment of final retrospect may the work of the title seem completed, or perhaps not. In some forms of slow journalism, not at all. Left partial, slightly out of reach because of the belatedness of journalistic practice asserting itself over the power of hindsight. In some ways, Leo Cooper's dilemma is ours, as Trillin writes. Even if Leo Cooper continues to think about that night for the rest of his life, there are questions he can never answer. In Trillin's essay, I've tried to suggest the moments when his story is most slow, most realistic, most transporting is perhaps when it is, in fact, most shadowed by its belatedness. And as such, we might imagine Calvin Trillin saying back to Ouija the following: through the ability to transpose hindsight into foresight, journalists indeed come to think of narrative as conquering time and thus making meaning. But perhaps, as Ouija also sensed, sometimes the quick flash of illumination only leaves us feeling behind the times, or perhaps that we are already in the dark.
That's three fantastic papers. Thank you, gentlemen, so much. Who would like to get things rolling?
Well, these are great papers. Josh, I was really impressed with yours. I taught Hersey for a long time, and I've always thought something was up with the plain style. I think you really nailed it. You're right, there is a difference in tone when you read the aftermath. It seems like it comes a little closer to tipping his hand, being more overt. I always tell my students that Hersey is kind of one Marilynne and Ross. They're both sort of traditional literary journalists who, in her introduction to Takes, her collection of reporting pieces for the New Yorker, Marilynne Ross talks about how she loves and admires Daniel Defoe because of his allegiance to facts. He only put down what he could see and what he could hear, kept himself out of it, the fly on the wall stuff. So I have to look up the date of that, but I think it might be about the same time Hersey was writing the legend on the license. It's such a reaction to the new journalists. It's like, these guys, they're too subjective, and yet you show beautifully and ironically that, he's there too. I just want to pass on one thing that I've gleaned over the years in my own study of Hersey. I happened to be in upstate New York once, where I'm from, when he was in town late in his life. When did he die? In the 80s? So
89, I think.
Yeah, it was like 85. He was signing books. He was signing Hiroshima in a tiny town stopped on the Underground Railroad called Peterborough. Anyway, here's what he wrote on one woman's book. He said, the crux of the matter is whether nuclear or atomic warfare is ever justified. So, and that was a story in the Syracuse Herald. I can give you the site if you send me your paper, I'd be glad to. But I always took that as meaning that he's got some real antipathy towards the bomb. I mean, who wouldn't after covering what he did? But also, I think he really wanted to spark discussion of it, get people to talk about it without. So I see it as very much supporting what you found as well. Anyway, yeah, so much for the plain style. And the same with Lillian Ross. I mean, it's not exactly plain style, but she's the most like him, I think, in terms of her antipathy towards the new journalist. And actually in the Yellow Bus, I mean, she has a point of view, definitely. Yeah, so I think you're onto something. And I really enjoyed the paper. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's this paper sort of, you're right, it is, Lindsay, it's something, a departure from kind of other stuff I do. It basically grew out of teaching Hiroshima every year, every other year, something like that, and just wondering why, and teaching it every year, and students were just enamored with it. But then also when Kathy Ford's piece came out on the publication history of, so that those of you know, it's called Profit and Public Interest, the publication history of John Hersey's Hiroshima. And it's amazing, it's just a wonderful piece. But I read it, and she talks about, she's the one I'm citing in terms of talking about how the piece was circulated so widely. And so then I started just thinking, like, why was that? Why did that happen? In that political, cultural context, Why did that happen? Thinking about, like, would something similar happen, after 9/11? 5 years after 9/11, could we read something, that was sort of, had empathy for a militaristic enemy, and would it be accepted in such a way? And so it just kind of comes out of trying to make some sense of why this went.
Well, another thing about the context, I know from teaching journalism history that at the time in mainstream American newspapers at least, it was all about, there's this wonderful new atomic invention. We're going to have atomic cafes, atomic refrigerators. It's going to be wonderful technology. It's sort
Power
of
too cheap to meter.
right,
That's right.
And it's the idea of, technology is, it's fearsome, but it's also going to be this great boom. And then, 40 years later, Hersey has that hindsight, which I think he expresses well in the aftermath, that it's not all it's cracked up to be. So I think that's sort of the context for it. I couldn't find anyone decrying much the atomic bomb. I mean, I found it in Dorothy Day's Catholic Worker, Peace and Justice advocacy publication. Yeah, totally against it. And actually, she predicts in the September 1945 issue, she predicts the arms race, basically, and says now it's all going to be whoever has the biggest or most powerful weapon. But I asked my parents, who were born in 1926 and 27, my dad was on a Navy ship, he was a very young man at the end of World War II, and I said, so what was it like? What did you hear about it? He said, well, captain called us together in the ship, said we were out somewhere in the South Pacific, I was a radio telegraph operator, and they basically told us, yeah, we had some new fabulous weapon, but it looked like it would bring the Japanese to their knees. And all we thought about was, oh God, we're going home. That was it. And the same stateside, my mother worked at a radio station. She said, yeah, we just heard it was this mysterious new weapon. People were thrilled because it meant the boys and the young women would come home. So no one is saying, oh, this is a horrible genie out of the bottle. And not in the mainstream press, not that I've seen. So, go ahead.
I'd kind of like to ask Chris a question as a way to get at something that Josh said. Let's take at face value Josh's statement that all styles are political. In talking about Calvin Trillin, would you agree with that? Does he have a political agenda?
That's a great question. I think that what I've been interested in is the political disposition of the New Yorker in relationship to small towns and cities, right? And so, Trillin, made his bones reporting on the civil rights movement. We said he's a liberal, of course he is. But to me, it's as much interesting, and I think to go to Josh's thing, it has something to do with the relationship of Hersey to the Japanese. Like, how do we understand that political relationship, that subject relationship that's political? So the answer to your question, yeah, I would say I think it is a political thing, but I think that the political, if we're talking about what the politics is, Trillin is constructing a kind of cosmopolitan authority in relationship to small towns by trying to assign to himself some of their values. And so that is a kind of liberalism, say. Yeah, absolutely. But it's a particular kind. Again, you may have a different take on it, but I think that Hersey's position relative to the Japanese, which Josh talked about really well, is one element of what we call the political that we have to think about.
It seems to me that if Trillin were here and we asked him that question, he might suggest that there were other meanings in style. I think he considered himself a cultural reporter. And so, you're talking about the relationship of cosmopolitanism to small town America. It's really a cultural relationship, not a political one.
Well, I don't make that distinction,
No,
but I think a lot of the essays sort of tap into sort of like the family values debate. I mean, the Cooper family, for instance. So he's sort of in that layer. But no, I think your point is cultural. I just think it is political.
To get to Josh a little bit, if Hersey's intention in his plain style was to make a political argument, what's your problem with that?
Well, a couple things. By political, I'm not necessarily saying sort of political in the sense of, say, a Washington reporter covering the presidential administration, or I'm not saying conservative or liberal. I have John Pauly's definition of political. He says the realm of symbolic confrontation in which groups of citizens organize, enact, and negotiate their relationships with one another. In terms of my problem, it's not so much an indictment of what Hersey's. My problem is he's not transparent in what he's doing, and so so as I ended the piece, I said, we can debate about sort of the whether this was an honest style or not. I guess where I would fall in that realm is, I think in some ways it's manipulative. I think that his rhetorical maneuvers in Hiroshima are manipulative, and I think that it's. Of course, we all bring our own sort of ways in which we read and interpret and interact with texts, and that sort of the meaning is not, injected into us or encoded necessarily. That's what Schutzer would say. But I see sort of that sort of lack of transparency combined with some of these decisions for, what's omitted and what is selected to be manipulative.
Can I make 2 comments about that? If I can remember both of them after I start to speak about the first. If his goals were political, I think the question is, how successful was he in achieving those goals? As you said, you don't criticize a book for not being the book that you would have written.
Yeah.
Richard Rhodes, in Making the Atomic Bomb, at the back of that, he's talked about the whole design and invention and testing and then the dropping of the atomic bomb. And he sort of says, how do I feel about this? He says, well, it's a terrible act, but I would simply point out that after those first 2 bombs were dropped, nobody has ever done it again. And one of the ways we came to understand the horror of that was through political acts like Hersey. If he had loaded his narrative with all the choices he didn't make, all the alternatives, it probably would not have been as effective a piece of writing. And you've, of course, taken on the book that's considered the greatest piece of literary journalism in the 20th century. The second point I would make is that if you want Hersey to be transparent about that you as a critic should apply the same to yourself. But critics usually don't. They usually try to stand above a text and say, well, this is what's wrong with the text. But they don't talk about it themselves.
So the second point, I get what you're. It's so funny because in the sort of run up to this, I was imagining this conversation unfolding.
So wait a minute, let Chris analyze this.
Yep.
Okay.
I've been preparing for this. In some ways, I do think that there's that I'm transparent. I make it clear sort of what my argument is about Hersey. I think I don't say that he's manipulative, but I think it's pretty clear sort of where I come down on.
But you just said he was manipulative.
Yeah. Okay. I will put a footnote, first footnote. In terms of his effectiveness, so I come back. So there's. Hersey concludes in the aftermath with dollar symbolism noting his main character, his memory like the world's was getting spotty. Said if Hersey's goal, as he claimed in both interviews and letters, was to have a moral impact, he seems to be acknowledging its effects were fleeting. I mean, I think, and I don't like to use the language of intent because I don't know Hersey. I mean, Hersey's dead, can't ask him. So it's rather just talking about what's the effect? What's the effect of doing what he's done? And I think looking at all of those reminders of like, on February 13th, 1960, France tested a nuclear weapon in the Sahara. On October 16th, 1964, he's doing this to sort of, the effect of doing that throughout Tanimoto's update at the end, because one of the things stylistically and structurally that Hersey does in the aftermath is he does not tell sort of the looping stories. He tells one story, then the next, and the next, and the next, and he ends with Tanimoto, and Tanimoto's big push both in the States and around the world to sort of end nuclear proliferation. And Hersey keeps undermining that with these asides about, and then there was this test, then there was this test, and then there was this test. And so I think, Yeah, I get your argument about it hasn't happened again, sure. But it didn't mean that other places weren't, as Hersey's pointing out, testing it and thinking about it and considering it. And so, I mean, the fact that we're all still alive and can sit here and debate this and say like, well, that's evidence that Hiroshima worked. I'm not sure that I'm on board with that.
We have someone up back in the room.
Does anybody mind if I switch a question to David for a moment?
I don't know.
Okay, because I don't know if you've done this line of thought, but David, that was really, really interesting, and I'm curious about Marilynne Robinson's not continuing on, it seems, to do much environmental journalism after this, and how much was the banning of her book? Do you have any inclination that that stifled her? And along, did she usher in any other writers to write books that watched The Watchdog after her?
It's a terrific question. So if you look at the arc of her career, there's, as I said, 25 years of silence between her first novel and then this trilogy that catapults her to world fame. She's proclaimed the greatest stylist, you know, of the day, today, alive. So, it does beg that question. But what happened was her nonfiction didn't go away after this book. She kept writing, and if you look at her career, she has continually referred to Emerson and Thoreau. This is why I had that Thoreau slide up there, as inspiration, not only for her fiction, but also for her nonfiction. Okay, so, and this is why I think Walden is such a key companion piece, because Walden is such a radical act of eco-criticism for its day. I think on par with this one being more overtly political, to be sure, but where her nonfiction writing goes, where her radicalism goes, is in her essays, and they're Emerson-esque. She has a book of essays called The Givenness of Things, which is overtly critical of materialistic culture, overtly critical of consumerism, of, political badgering that she considers unfair, etc. I mean, these are really echoes, 21st century echoes of exactly the kind of criticism that Emerson was making in a lot of his essays about his culture surrounding him. So she's really updating that with the givenness of things and becoming radical there. She's also giving addresses, for example, at Stanford University, at University of Iowa. She also gave an address specifically about recovering the humanities in higher education. This is exactly an Emerson concern too, is that the professionalization of young men and women's minds is being funneled toward industry too narrowly, and we're losing in the process that broad liberal arts kind of emphasis. Robinson, I would argue, is probably the greatest champion for rescuing the humanities in this sort of age of brokering all of higher ed to, just training for industry. We're teaching our English and journalism students to just be good workers out there, that's all. So she's terrific in combating that, precisely in the way that Emerson was. And I'll just finish my point by saying that she gave a speech which, the one that I alluded to at Stanford and at Iowa, was billed as an American Scholar speech, just like Emerson's American Scholar speech. So, and it's wonderful, I would argue, literary journalism, because Harper's picked it up and reprinted it completely. So you guys can, take a look at it in Harper's. It's wonderful. It's something like Crisis in Higher Education or something, I believe, is something along the phrase of the title. But that's where her journalism went. It went sort of Emersonian, it went to the lectern, and went to the essay.
Josh, to pick up the discussion about your article, just as an editorial point, if you're trying to diminish the effect of taking such a strong point of view against Hersey, you might eliminate things like assaults the reader with facts and pernicious effect and remove all agency from. I mean, that's pretty strong language in terms of what Hersey was trying to do. I have done some research on some different people. Tex McCrary had a talk show in the 1950s and apparently joined, I think, Canadian forces to get in World War II because the U.S. wasn't in it fast enough, and he was a PR guy. And sometime after the war, he was interviewed about this effect, and he was on site like a PIO, like being able to take journalists into Hiroshima, and he advised them not to go because what we've done here is too horrible. And the way he explained it was, he as a PR guy, he said, I told people not to go, Hersey went in anyway. That's the difference between PR and journalism. Of the two at the time, of the decision at the time, clearly the preferable one was to go, and then the outcome is what it is. So one of the things I'm always concerned about for academic criticism and academic critiques is understanding the reporter or the writer at the time, whatever their conditions are. I write about documentarians, so a lot of times they're in muddy trenches and they're being shot at and they're under a deadline, and whereas the academics, we sit up in our offices and we have the luxury of time that they don't have. How, if your editor said, put yourself in Hersey's time, put him in that moment, how could you do that? And how might that affect how you analyze the text? Especially given this idea of don't cover it at all versus cover it with something that's got a 70-year life cycle to it.
I guess I'd flip that around and say, why didn't Hersey include that in his text?
Okay.
Well, I mean...
I would reject that. I mean, as an academic point of view, I would just reject that.
Why?
Well, there are lots of norms of attribution that are prominent in the trade, not in academia. For instance, if Hersey had said, that he's, this man felt that way, comma, and then said, as he revealed to me in a later interview, that would be a standard attribution. That would be in the trade. So, I mean, there are lots of instances where what Josh is talking about is going against certain trade norms, isn't it? It's not making an academic, I don't think.
I guess I just don't see sort of saying like put yourself in Hersey's shoes. I can't put myself. What I can do is, as a historian, I can go back and I can sort of
put it in his time.
Yeah, okay, but that's different. That's not what you're asking me to do. You're saying put yourself in his shoes.
Well, I said put him in that location.
Okay, well, I think I do, and I think I understand sort of, and in the fuller paper, I have him, I do kind of explain how he, where he is, and how he gets to Japan and the number of days and weeks he's there, and the editorial process. And I mean, I think in the paper, I'll be happy to send it to you. You can look at it. But in terms of, I mean, I don't see why it's not an academic critique to say why didn't Hersey include that in the piece? I mean, he doesn't have to. He can do whatever the hell he wants. But what I'm saying as a critic is looking at it and saying, okay, you chose to select and frame these things and not these things. That's fine. But what I'm going to say is by selecting and framing these things and not these things, that has an effect. And that we need to acknowledge that effect rather than just continue to perpetuate the idea that this book is so powerful just because he bears witness. Well, no, he didn't just bear witness. He constructed a story. And I think it's a very well constructed story. But I think what we need to do is understand that it is a construction, as opposed to just saying, "Oh wow, this was once in a lifetime event, and he's there covering it." I don't know that gets us very far in any sort of discourse about politics of style.
Is there any literary or journalism writing that's not construction?
No, and I say that in the piece.
Right. So the fact that it's constructed and the fact that it does some things and doesn't do others is typical of all writing. I mean, that's also your point, that everything's political.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that sort of the criticism, or the criticism of the scholarship, both popular and academic, has focused on content and not on the stylistic construction, and that's the gap, the knowledge gap that I'm trying to fill.
That's a fair point. I still would probably downplay it.
Can I just jump in? And I think it's precisely that plain style that has drawn people away from talking about style, because as his title of his paper is called, Hidden in Plain Sight. This is his politics. He's wearing it on its sleeve. It's the elephant in the room that's so close that you just see gray, right? It's there. That he is political. He wouldn't have chosen this topic and framed it this way and chosen and selected to, constructed, everything is constructed, but why this way? And let me just say also, this is my 19th century Americanist side of me coming out, the same exact argument has been made of Herman Melville and his magazine fiction of the 19th century, which is to say, right, he was catering to a broader magazine audience, which is analogous to the magazine audience that Hersey was trying to pitch to. Yet, and so he was abiding by a lot of the standard conventions, right, to reach them. Yet he was totally being political in his deeper messages and his deeper critiques of culture. I want to say that he was forwarding. There's nothing tame about his magazine fiction, Melville's magazine fiction. In the same way, there's nothing at all sort of defanged or what was the line, boring that somebody laid on him. No, but it's subtle, and I think in the figurative language, it's not hyperbolic. It's like crushed by books. That's saying a lot, but it's subtle, right? I mean, it's not amplitude on that kind of figure of speech is not particularly going to kill you with, oh, he's right, being figurative or manipulative, but it's there, and I think this is part of the genius of this bravura explication of this text. I think that we're hearing today, but from Josh. If those are my cards.
Latin here, ars est celare actem. So it's the art to hide that you are being artful. So ars est celare actem. So that's Latin. So some more Latin.
More Latin. I think if I could just make one more comment, that the word political bothers me because in the context I think it was counter-political. Because if it had been political in 1946, the New Yorker would have come out and said, we fried 145,000 Japanese. Cheers. All of the million American soldiers sitting in ships off the Japanese coast would have said, great, we're not going to die invading the mainland. They would have been all in favor of it. And we should probably look at why Hersey chose that style. But as Josh said, this is very hard to do now. Perhaps the editors of the New Yorker said, look, if we come out with something that says we've done a horrible thing, we're going to die as a magazine. So they made it very subtle, very human. Maybe they chose that style for political reasons, and they were effective in turning us against the bomb, which I think is a good thing. As opposed, if they had come out and said, hooray for the bomb, we wouldn't be talking about it today.
Yeah, last comment, just
Yeah, I mean, I think for all that we can say about Hersey's effectiveness, I mean, what David's paper is in some ways about the normalization of nuclear power. So there are various different things that happen here. And the question, I don't know if David will have a chance to answer this, but one of the things I was thinking about with your paper was that there's sort of a long migrating tradition of writers going after the reformers rather than after the corruptors, and sort of like the perfection. Lincoln says this thing about the perfection of reform is the perfection of corruption, so the simple question is, was she wrong to go after Greenpeace? Was that a mistake?
Was that a mistake? Well, I think she underestimated the British libel laws, that's for sure. She's American, right? Right? She went over the pond.
Yeah, but I mean,
she
in a
got
sense,
punished
it's sort
for
of
that.
moving the target a little, isn't it? Right?
Well, she did what essentially is fascinating, because you talk about politics. The politics of academic publishing and academic journals has actually affected us, for us who want to write about her and her attack on Greenpeace, in the sense that IAL, the Journal of Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and the Environment, ISLE, has not published one article on Marilynne Robinson, precisely because they consider Greenpeace sacrosanct, and you cannot touch Greenpeace, even though there's undeniable, overwhelming evidence here that Greenpeace was guilty of sin. look, they wouldn't have banned and pulped this, they wouldn't have sued her, and then the American arm wouldn't have denied anything to do. We have the evidence here, right? But so the reality is that ISLE, that journal, will not publish anything on Robinson because she has been blacklisted for this reason. So they've decided that she doesn't support environmental groups, just a blanket statement, which is absurd. She's more environmentalist than, right, almost any of her peers writing at the time, because she's so willing to go after, the pseudo watchdogging function of those environmental groups. So yeah, I mean, I think was she wise? Was she not wise in doing that? I think, as she says, she wished that she had damaged their reputation, right? So in some senses, Mother Country, her book, is a failed project because it didn't do the final damage that she wanted it to do. Thanks to their libel laws, pulping it, pulling it out of view. This is pre-internet too, so this doesn't see the light of day in the late 90s at all. No one sees it. Americans don't see it. Nobody. Which is part of why I wanted to show you the day after and the China syndrome, etc. That's what Americans were seeing. They were seeing Jimmy Carter on the nightly news. They were seeing the movie. That's how the narrative, the dominant discourse of nuclear power and the degradation of the environment was being channeled. This was a big portion of that narrative, physically, utterly silenced. And because it's pre-internet, it's a media issue, right? That arm of media is just simply amputated. And wow, to see her sort of keep it alive through these comments in interviews that would otherwise go completely unnoticed, it's sickening on one level, but it's also heartening because we have voices now that we can bring this book out, keep it alive, add it to the canon of great literary environmentalist journalism.
Thank you, David. We actually have a long afternoon, but thank you for a fantastic discussion. We'll leave it there for this session. Would you like to thank our presenters?